Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a podcast that's possibly got visuals, and it is about designing better miniature games. My good friend Glenn Ford, miniature games designer, and me, Mike Hutchinson, also miniature games designer, have been talking about designing miniature games on this here internet for a few years. And you'd think that we'd run out of topics, but we haven't. We got another giant list of them. And the topic that I would like to discuss, Glenn's not certain what his opinions are, but I think he's winding up for one. I was listening to a very fine game design podcast called the Indie Game Design Clinic or Indie Game Clinic. Uh, uh, they've been doing a lovely a series of podcasts on the game designer's bookshelf, and so they're picking off some classic texts and some unexpected texts, and saying how they might relate to you as an indie game designer and what they can, are they useful? Should everyone read the Art of Games Design Book of Lenses or not? That kind of stuff. Anyway, they were reading Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, which I listened to on Audible a few years back when I was joining Epic Games, because it just seemed like a thing where I wanted to understand some of the industry that I hadn't really been part of and what some of the war stories were. And it's all right for that. I prefer the book about the geezers who were at id eating pizza and shouting at each other. That one's a more fun story than Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, but Blood, Sweat, and Pixels is all right. Anyway, out of one of the chapters bubbled this idea that there was an observation from one of the set of people that were being interviewed that framing your game design principles in negative terms was sometimes a much more effective way to align a design, and in particular to align a group of people around making a thing and coming to some conclusions about what to do, than framing things in a positive way. And I thought this was interesting because I've been quite um, I've been quite interested. I wouldn't say militant, but like I've been very interested in positively framing design principles when I work on them, because it just seems like that creates generative positive energy, and it like creates space in front of you, rather than negatively framing them, because that's sort of reactionary and self-limiting and stuff. But they were saying, well, look, there was this, I can't remember which game it was they were talking about, but there was this game, and they, as a small team, were able to make something really good really fast, because they would have ideas, and they would be able to hold it up against the sort of razor and say, nope, that's failed the it shouldn't be this test, and so it just got cut. And so the idea of a negative design principle being like maybe a component of a good set of design principles that allows you to like quarterize and neuter things before they get in all mixed up in your design, rather than like slightly more nebulous positive things like, it should make me feel purple, and like I don't know if this makes me feel purple or not. So yeah, I thought that would be an interesting topic.
Yeah, I mean, my instinct is that there's uses to them at different stages along the life of the game.
Hmm.
So my first reaction is that one of the things I see a lot in like first designs and sort of uh, you know, first stabs at making games is sort of one or another form of reactive game design where
Mm.
somebody has played a thing. The thing that you see classically in Heartbreakers is they've played a thing which they like, but they don't like X about it. And so the new thing they are designing is its primary design principle is to be like X, but without the thing that I don't like in X.
Hmm.
And so you sometimes see people, and you see this, I think, like a lot of the time with people who pop up with, for example, ideas that they're going to design a TCG, and they have a list of things that they don't like about Magic, and they're going to not do these things, and you see a list of things that the game isn't, and then you end up basically saying, well, well, what is the game? You know, you've told me a list of things the game is, and I have no idea what the game is. And the answer a lot of the time is, well, the game is magic. The game is as close to Magic the Gathering as I can possibly cleave without doing any of these things.
Mm.
And that ends up being like, I think, for an early framing of a set of design principles, inherently unhelpful. At the same time, one of the most sort of fun like design things I ever went through was the point where we were getting to the late stages in designing Gaslands, and I we both knew that there were things that were not Gaslands, that there were
Hmm.
certain rules. Somebody would say, you know, oh, it'd be really cool if this thing could do X, and I could just say, but yeah, but that's not Gaslands, and I know there's no point me bringing that idea to Mike because it's not Gaslands. And at that point, once the game, you know, was a bit more formed, it was the no, that's not Gaslands thing that was a real sort of Occam's razor of like speedy development design, because you just go there's no point going down that alleyway. It just isn't, that isn't a Gaslands rule, it isn't a Gaslands mechanic, it isn't a Gaslands world. And so I think I think possibly what I'm saying is like, if your game is strong enough to have its own negative design principles, then negative design principles are probably quite helpful. But early on, most of the negative design principles you'll have won't be your game's negative design principles. They will be reactive to other games and other experiences, and sort of saying, well, I don't want to do what he's doing, and I don't want to do what he's doing. And I think that early on, that's way less helpful, because it's not defining what you're doing, and it's more likely to lead you down that sort of that heartbreaker side alley where you end up making a thing that feels like you've only ever seen one game in the particular genre.
Hmm.
Um, the other thing I think is, it's like, when you're designing, you're often sort of setting off into like an unknown wilderness with no map. And like, there are 1,000, 1,001 things that every bit of your game could be. And something that tells me that it's not going to be one of those 1,001 things. It's like, it's generally early on, it's not a deductive process, um and I think, like, some people say that they design like a painter. You've got a blank canvas and you're adding brushstrokes onto it. And
Mm.
some people say that they're like, there's a block of marble and you're a sculptor and you're chiseling it out. And I think that, a lot of the time it's much more like, you've got an empty stand and you're plugging clay onto it fairly haphazardly until you get
Mm.
a big enough block of clay that's around about the size of the block of marble. And then you get some chisels out and you start sort of chipping back away to sort of to refine that ugly clay glump that you've sweated building in the first place. And I think, like, if what you have at first are like negative design principles, you're, to stretch an already twanging analogy, stood there in front of the plinth and somebody's telling you, well, don't throw the clay on the wall or the ceiling or the floor. It's like, I wasn't going to. I was going to be aiming for the plinth. Believe me,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
first like
yeah.
the
What do you
first
want me to make? Well, don't make an octopus.
yeah.
Don't make the concept of ennui. Okay, where do I go?
Don't make
So,
all of the
like,
grid.
one of the reasons that this is interesting to me, I suppose, is that uh, Gaslands had a set of design principles at the beginning, several of which were negatively framed. And when I look back at them, I wonder whether they were design principles for Gaslands or whether they were me trying to figure out my own voice as a designer. So the very first one that I wrote down, the like design principle number one for Gaslands was never sacrifice fun on the altar of realism.
Hmm.
Um, and so like I still feel very specifically what that meant. It's also like it's kind of a mission statement for me as a designer more than it is. But I mean, it also applies to that game, and there have been um, games where like arguably Pacific Command does try and sacrifice fun on the altar of realism somewhere in some places, but I still think it's pretty much true because that's the kind of designer I want to be. But like, don't sacrifice fun on the altar of realism was a that was like a heartbreaker kind of a situation insofar it was a big shove away from the shore of what I perceived of as a certain kind of games design in order to push this in a different direction. um I don't know.
I don't know. I think like a lot of the time, negative design principles feel like sort of telling myself not to do things that I probably wasn't going to do anyway. It's like, that thing of like, oh, don't.
No, because that was useful because I mean there's probably a positive way of framing it, but like when I would get excited about some gritty part of the resolution system or some mechanic or whatever, I could go, no, we're like this is supposed to be cartoony and not, realistic. And so I could have said, it's Mario Kart, not Gran Turismo, which is also still slightly negatively framed, but like
Hmm.
what Never Sacrifice Fun on the Altar of Realism allowed me to do is say things like the way that momentum works in collisions is just like this, and you're just going to have to deal with that.
But the thing about that particular principle, never sacrifice fun on the altar of realism, is that fun is a famously like nebulous term, and you're totally justified in going, well, I'll tell you what's fun about this particular moment. How realistically can you push the button and exactly what? And then it's like,
Yeah, yeah,
well, in
yeah.
that case, there is no like.
Yeah, fair enough. It's Never Sacrifice Fun in Mike's definition of what that is.
In
Yeah,
that particular moment. There's no
yeah.
inherent conflict between fun and realism. The two can literally be simultaneously the exact same thing. So it's not a hard negative design principle. It's not like a design principle that says never use a D4 because they're gross.
Well, so here's another one. So this we're just jumping down the list here. Principle number 6 for Gaslands: never knock a player out of the game. Wow, have I got egg on my face on that one?
Yeah, you just full on ignored that.
Just full on ignored that one. Like I still get night sweats about knocking people out of the game in Gaslands, but there it is, right there in the game.
Yeah, and I
But
think like
I wasn't good enough to stick to that principle. I wasn't confident enough. I still don't know if I am. But like never knock a player out of the game as a design principle. That seems like a good one. I didn't stick to it, but that seems like an acceptable negatively framed, like a useful negatively framed principle.
Well, I mean, as with everything, there are a handful of like common wisdoms about game design, player elimination,
Mm,
misser turns, those sorts of things are just like, be really question why you're going to put them into your game because they are like widely hated. And I
mm.
think like, if your negative design principle is don't do things that players generally really hate have happen to them, it's a bit like, again, that just feels a bit like, I mean, yeah. Um, yeah, and I think it's like,
Yeah, which is I think back to that, like to a degree, some of these initial design principles were not about Gaslands, but were about me as a designer. And maybe there's something in that, which is like, maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't. But like if you're trying to create games and you're interested in maybe having a style, then maybe trying to write down like what is your design style or your design principles or your kind of brand house style or whatever. Um,
yeah, just
yeah.
I I think I find it hard to think of negatively framed design principles that aren't either more efficiently framed as positive ones or
Hmm.
aren't kind of so banal as to be not worth mentioning. It's like the idea that negative design principles are easier to stick to is like Well, yeah, they probably are, because I can list a crap ton of things that any given game I'm working on is never going to go anywhere near. It's
Hmm.
like I'm making a game, let's say, that only uses playing cards for random number generation. I can list a whole bunch of stuff that you do with dice that are design principles that shouldn't turn up in that game. And it's
Yeah,
like,
I never throw an object in this game.
yeah, it's like, my goodness, these negative principles are easy to keep to. All I do is never pick up a dice, and I've got a list of about 20 that I'm ticking off a little box next to every single day. And it's like, because I'm thinking about like Pukeapocalypse, sort of, if I chose to frame it negatively, the framing would be to like never have non-diegetic tokens in the game, because that
Hmm.
happens to be like, but that's not the that wasn't in any way the driving principle. The driving principle is to have diegetic, status noting tokens in the game. That's the thing that's like, well,
Mm.
that's the fun thing, that's the cool thing, that to have tokens that note the status of your miniatures, that the miniatures can see and react to and slip over in, and have all that sort of stuff go on. And so, like, the idea of then noting, oh, and by the way, don't put any tokens in that are non-diegetic, because that won't match with the big driving principle of the game. I could have
Hmm.
written that down somewhere, but it literally never occurred to me. So it would sort of be, like I say, a sort of an odd exercise. And like I said, I'm genuinely trying to think of like negative design principles.
Well, so another one, so one from A Billion Suns. I'm going to slightly ignore the positive framing because because it's got anyway. Number four for A Billion Suns was uniquely sci-fi brackets, not reskinned naval close brackets. So just focusing on the not reskinned naval design principle, like that to me feels like it has the potential to be interesting because like I'm bringing in genre expectations, I'm bringing in previous game expectations, and I might bring in something like you can do boarding actions in A Billion Suns, and then I can hold it up to the light of not reskinned naval, thank you very much, and go, is this is this in here because it's science fiction, or is this in here because I'm just borrowing a bunch of reskinned naval stuff from other games or other genres? So not reskinned naval, like there's a flavor of heartbreaker about that insofar as like, well, I want to make a lovely spaceship game, but everyone else does this in a certain way, or the prevailing wisdom is do it in a certain way, and so my design principle will be to zig when everyone else zags.
Yeah, I think the thing is, that's a principle to me that's about asking what is interesting to you about doing a space game. And
Yeah.
it's like the thing that it always that phrase always used to make me think of was, there's a Star Trek um episode of all things where like every like ship to ship battle in Star Trek always involves two ships coming towards each other like that on a nice flat plane. Da, 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 da. And there's one of the later ones in Next Generation where there's two ships like this, and I think it's like one where Riker has a separate ship, and Riker comes up like that from underneath, and it's so like that moment. It is the first time you see it. It was obviously when I was like a teenager, is like absolutely mind melting. It just breaks
Right.
every
What?
rule that the
Riker can't
whole
do that.
whole of Star Trek has established. It's like watching a Bruce Lee fight, and then all like 10 guys pile into him at once, and you'd be like, "No, just a minute. Those aren't the rules of a kung fu movie. What are you thinking?"
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and really, it's like that principle is sort of like, to me, it's less about, you know okay, let's read all of the naval fleet battle games and make sure we're not doing what any of the naval fleet battle games are doing. And it's more about going, well, why am I doing a deep space game as opposed to a fleet battle game? Why am I
Yeah.
doing a Billion Suns as opposed to Pacific Command? And I don't think it's really not just a reskinned naval fleet battle thing, rather a sort of like, okay, there's a bunch of things about space that aren't true about the ocean, and a lot of other games don't happen to use any of those things. Those are the things I'm interested in, and that's why I say it's like even then it feels to me like a shorthand for a whole bunch of positive principles. Do you know what I mean? It's like that
Yeah,
next
and like,
principle is
yeah, yes, completely, completely. And like in that case, it's much more like, I've played a lot of X-Wing and TIE Fighter when I was a kid, and like, and Descent and stuff like three-dimensional, there is no horizon flight simulators was a thing in the 90s, and I loved them. And
mm,
that sort of, without doing 3D hyper chess, that's sort of what I wanted from A Billion Suns, is I wanted to find ways that I could evoke the chaotic three-dimensional reality of like that sort of the cinema, not the reality, the three-dimensional cinema of that sort of space combat, without actually having to have pegs and things bending around and stuff. I think this is fun actually, because I think what I'm discovering from having this discussion is that partly I think my old design principle writing was quite bad, and I completely agree. Like, it's really difficult to find a properly useful way of offering a negatively framed design principle in a way that feels worth its weight being a principle. Because I think that, as I'm thinking back to the conversation that was being reflected on, that was in this book, which was that like there was a bunch of people working really hard on something with a short deadline, and they needed some kind of like um just sorting hats to be like, fuck it, we got to ship this level. Is it good enough? Well, does it have any, does it have any sacks of potatoes in it? No, it doesn't have any sacks of potatoes. Then it meets the goal. Let's ship the mashed potato level.
yeah, because I think so. There's like two things I sort of want to say there, because it's like tracking back to the Billion Suns principle of it not being like a reskin naval fleet game
Mm,
is I don't think ever I heard you say, well, you can't do that in a Billion Suns because that's what they do in some naval fleet games. We can't have it. And even to the point where like recently somebody floated the idea of them being broadsides in a Billion Suns. And your
mm,
reaction wasn't, well, of course it can't have broadsides. Naval fleet battle games are replete with broadsides.
mm.
Your response was, well, let's consider that. And, after a few conversations have been like, oh, that happens to not be the sort of thing that the combat in this game is interested in. And by God, at this point, there are a couple of bits of Man of War that are, because Man of War does everything better that is
Yep.
sneaky into. So it's like, that's just not a principle that you've actually used to be like negatively
Yes, although I suppose
about
like
framing that part of it.
yes, although I suppose like as I was working on the Armageddon sort of straight up battle mode, I was like really aware of, you know, what Battleship Gothic feels like, what one page rules war fleets feels like, what Void Admiral feels like, and they all feel one way, and I wanted, even in a battle mode, to have it feel something different.
And I think like the other thing I'd say is I think like negative design principles, and I don't know if this is because it's the nature of like tabletop games or something, are more likely to get in the way of an elegant solution than positive design principles, because some like an elegant solution to a problem will present itself and you'll be, well, I can't use it because my negative design principle says I'm not allowed to use that sort of thing. It's like the one that like is throbbing in my brain at the moment is like the Doomed.
Mm,
um that has like some negative design principles basically stated in the book, and they're about like not requiring tracking and stats and things like that. And there are various points in that rule system where I'm just pleading for them to put in like one bit of tracking, because it like the campaign system, there's so many points we just say, oh please, just that design principle is killing this bit of the game.
I think that that's interesting, because it's basically saying like, in when you're managing designers, when you're working with designers or software developers, like you're always looking to provide optionality and provide like an idea of where we're heading, but not routes by which we reach that destination or specifics about how we implement things. And it is really tricky to imagine design goals that don't end up reducing the solution space directly rather than sort of just telling you what it is that you're trying to achieve and then leaving the solution space as open as possible.
Yeah, because it's like the reason the doomed popped into my head is because I was sitting here trying to think of some like negative design principles, and the one that popped into my head is like, okay, well, measureless movement feels like you can phrase it as a negative design principle, which is like no measurements.
Mm.
And the doomed is a great example of where it's like, oh, for goodness sakes, could I agree that you're not having measureless movement. Could you let me pick up a tape measure like once or twice? Because if you just said, nothing like there's a 1 inch measurement or a 2 inch measurement for this thing or for that thing, so much of life would be like so much easier in that game. But
Mm.
instead, you've got these sort of quite clunky things to get around never ever ever having anybody measure anything ever. And it's like I own like 5 tape measures and they're set right there on the shelf. Please let me pick one up rather than do this. And it's like measureless movement as a positive design principle is great. It's interesting. It throws up a whole bunch of ideas. Not using a tape measure ever or
Mm.
measuring anything ever as the negative like corollary to that is bad, because you can have measureless movement but still say, yeah, but everything's you've got like a 3 inch bubble for a particular aura, or this is what counts as being in face-to-face contact, or
Mm.
things of that nature, and save yourself like pages of, okay, this is how we're going to check if something is in like a particular, or you have a little shift move which is like the width of your base or something. Well, how am I going to measure the width of my base? Have a spare base? Could I have a spare tape measure instead of a spare? No, no, you're not allowed to touch a tape measure, but my bases are all an inch across. I don't care that your bases are all an inch across. Thou shalt not measure an inch. Ah! you know so it's like, again, the positive design principle, I feel like, opens up an area of design and allows you to take any solution that presents itself to best fix the problems that it then throws up. The
I
negative
mean,
design principle says, if a best solution crosses this line, you
it's
know.
not allowed. Yeah. I mean, I guess the corollary of this is that there are positively framed design principles which are either too specific because they tell you what the answer is. So, like this isn't a brilliant example, but like one of the Gaslands principles was like, um, there's only one way of using Gaslands templates, and I ended up ignoring that because it was an irritating design principle that, I mean, essentially it is a negatively framed design principle, isn't it? There's only one way of using a Gaslands template says there are no other ways of using, you cannot use Gaslands templates in any other way, which ended up being annoying. And I ended up using them in different ways because actually sometimes it was fun to put the template in a different place or a different orientation or whatever. Um, and there are also ways of having positively framed design principles which are so big or nebulous that they end up being pointless. Like one of the ones from A Billion Suns was allow every possible sci-fi trope. Impossible. Like it just impossible. Like a
Mm,
stupid principle that can't be adhered to, useless. Um, and so I think like this conversation is making me feel like I'm going to stick to my guns, which is if you negatively frame something, just turn it into a positive and it will almost certainly be stronger. But that broadly, even more broadly speaking, like good design principles are hard to write, and so you should look at them sternly and try and make sure that they are scoped to the Goldilocks width of like they are providing something out in front that's sort of aspirational, which is like achievable but difficult, and isn't constricting your solution space too much. Like it's not telling you how you solve that problem, but it's giving you like what it feels like to have solved that problem.
mm.
Um, Yeah, and look, yeah, and the writing design principles is hard.
Yeah, and I think like my final thought on it is like I think it's interesting that the thing you were reading about it is like in relation to video games where
Mm,
they have to build an architecture and a set of tools to like build the world that they're going to be like existing in. And so I can, because the one place I do think that, there are sort of negative design principles in miniatures games, particularly, are about the hardware that you ask your players to gather, like at the start of the game.
hmm.
It's like I have like a bunch of negative design principles which are along the lines of I can't expect a player to go out and get 50 tarot decks, you know?
Yeah, or like the 10 D20 pool you
Yeah,
don't see
yeah.
very often.
The 1,000 D20s or a D1, a D47 or those sorts of things. I
Yeah,
have
and I guess like it's those are less negatively framed design principles and more just like practical considerations of like how your game can actually be operated and brought to the table
yeah,
sensibly.
and I think that's sort of the thing. It's like
Don't force me to have a giant collection of painted miniatures that I may only use 10% of.
yeah, and this is the thing. I think like in relation to negative design principles, the sort of games we're working on sort of pre-exist within a certain circle. I know you've already got a bunch of D6. I know you've already got a tape measure. I know you've already got a table and some terrain and some miniatures. You know, the negative things I design principles are that I'm not going to ask you to go too far outside of that. Whereas if you're doing a video game, your player has a computer, you know, and then everything that you're going to give them, you're basically going to okay, you might be using whatever Unity or something of that nature, but fundamentally, you're giving them everything, and so everything you give them, you've got to like build from the ground up. And at that
Mm.
point, I can see it's a lot more like okay, one of our design principles is that we're not going to have, I don't know, orchestral music anywhere in this because then we've got to go and arrange actual orchestral music because we've got to build that baloney, you know?
Right. So you're suggesting that in a way we start from a position of relative constraint as opposed to a video game which has a lot broader capabilities. I think that's one of the reasons that we see so fewer genres of games in miniatures than we do
Mm.
in video games. But
Yeah,
that's another question for another
yeah,
day.
yeah. Well, it makes me think of the scene in Apollo 13 where the engineers are trying to like figure out how to fix the problem that's on the space shuttle. And a guy walks in with a big box of stuff and he turns it onto the table and he says, well, this is what they've got. This is what we have to make it from. Whereas somewhere else, there are a bunch of engineers that are building the next space shuttle and they're allowed to use anything they want. Those guys need some negative design principles to sort of, the guys with the table full of objects don't need negative design principles because
They've
they're
got them
right
all.
there on the table in front of them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's the thing that boxes them in. And I think we're a bit more like that first group of guys where we're like, well, this is already boxing us in to a degree. So we need to think as far outside the box of how I can use a D6 as a thing that it works in my game, like with Space Kids, rather than being like, I have to write down some negatives about what I can't do with this D6, you know?
Well,
Anyway,
that in itself feels like a nice design principle for this whole enterprise.
absolutely. Okay, I don't know. Like, I'm really struggling to frame negative design principles in a useful way. That doesn't mean that you haven't framed some really intelligent, clever, worthwhile negative design principles. If so, I'd love you to go down to the comment sections and state them. Like, negative is is a very negative word to use in relation to them. It's sort of pre feels like it's preloading them as
Yeah,
being a
it's like,
bad thing.
but it's like constraining, restrictive, selective.
Guiding, guideline principles. I don't know. Whatever
Mm.
I can't even think of a positive positive word for them. That's how hard.
Intentionally selective design principles.
Yes, if you've got some delightfully selective design principles, go down to the comment section. Tell us what they are. I'd really love to hear them. Um, hit on the like and subscribe as you're going on there to do that. And then check out the links section because a bunch of links over in there. There's links to our Discord where I'm certain that people will be having little chats about like negative and positive design principles when this goes up. There's links across to our patrons where you can support the channel directly. Links to the various places where you can buy the things we have written and designed and support us slightly more indirectly. There's probably still could be a link over to the Billion Suns beta. I don't know like when this video is going to come out in relation to that. So there's a whole bunch of places where you can come and interact and be part of the community and help us out and help each other out. But for now, I think from this episode, this rule of carnage is going to be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye.
Cheerio.